Hello, in part 1 of this tutorial I showed you the basics of placing elements using .html. In this video we're going to discuss some of the more advanced features of .html, and I'm going to show you why it's a great framework to use when building dynamic web pages. Recall that we're trying to use .html to build the .html example framework. So let's open up our code editor. Now all of this stuff right here that I have selected is going to be repeated code. This code is actually going to be repeated once per example. So instead of having it repeat like so, right, we can just use a widget for this. Normally you would put the widgets at the top of your code, or I guess you could export them into their own JavaScript file if you want. We're going to put them right here. And the syntax for creating a widget in dot is to call dot.create widget, and then we have to give it a name and a callback. I'm going to name this widget example, and callback is obviously going to be a function. The function should return the .html page building object. The page building object is of course the same object that's returned by any .html page building function, or you can just return dot if you want. So if you wanted to have some code in here and you return dot, that'll work. And what that does is it allows your function to be chainable, so that it'll work with the rest of .html the same way that .html is intended to be used, which is by chaining functions together. The advantage of using a widget is that you can create some slightly more complex stuff. Like let's say that I wanted to have a widget that prints out the word example. Then I could just use elements example, and that will print out a div that has the word example in it. And by the way, there's something that I should have said in part 1 of the tutorial that I didn't say, and that is that let's say that you didn't want to have a div, you just wanted to print out the word example. The way you would do that in dot is there's a special tag, there's a special widget called h, and h will just render markup. So whatever's in here will render as HTML markup, and it's not going to be contained within any element. Oh yeah, and I think this is a common pitfall. Don't forget to include the return statement. Right? You're not just calling dot, you actually have to return the dot page building object in order for it to be chainable. Okay, so let's try this out. We'll comment out the rest of our code for now. And then we'll call the example by just calling it by its name. We've passed in the name here. The name is example, so we will call it by using example. Just like that. And we can run that, and there you go. Widgets can accept parameters, so let's try to print out the text within a parameter. Oops. Okay. And now we can call the widget as many times as we want. And there you go. Of course, there's no elements or anything like this. This is just a text node in HTML. So we want to put all of this code into the widget. So we're just going to copy it out. Oh, and I guess this isn't really part of an example. This is more like the title of our page, so I'll cut that out. Put it back here. And I think I have an extra dot here. Okay. But there are certain values here that are kind of hard written that we should modify, like the name of the example. We'll want to have a different name for every example in our tests library, and also the code that gets run, and I guess that's it. So we'll need to pass those in as parameters. So let's do that. We'll have a title and a run callback. Put our title here. Now the idea is that the run callback is going to be a function that has a return value, which is a .html page building object. So we can just copy that, and remember when we click the button, this happens, and it'll empty out whatever this target is. We're going to have to set this so that it's not always example1. And instead of putting this in an h1, we're going to, in fact, I'll comment this out for later, because that'll still be, I'll keep that as our first example. And we'll put this inside of a h element. And this will render an internal .html page building element. So we can just pass in run callback. And this is a trick you can use not just with the h element, but with any element within .html. If you pass in a function, it will actually run the function and take the return value, and whatever the return value is, it will try to render that as markup. So if the function returns a .html page building object, it'll render that as markup. If it returns a string, it will render the string as markup. If it returns an array, it'll render the array as markup. And I'll explain how arrays work, because that's a separate case we haven't handled yet. But I'll show you how that works in a minute. In fact, run callback doesn't even need to be a function. You could pass in pure .html into this parameter, and that will be rendered just fine with the code that we have here. But you know, the reason you'd pass it in as a function by design of this widget is that we can get the body of the function using run callback.toString, and now you don't have to pass the body of the function in as a separate parameter. You can just kind of jack that off of the code that gets passed in here. But in principle, in .html, you can pass in functions pretty much into any page building function for the most part. Okay, stay with me now. Let's rename this. And we're going to use our widget. And of course, the return value of this function needs to be the actual dot markup that we want to run. Oops. And we just have a couple more things to clean up. The example1, so we're not always going to be printing to this example1 ID. Instead, we can actually just put a global variable out here. And then at the end of our widget, we can just increment that. And don't forget to put that in here. And finally, this example, you know, the toString for the function, the run callback, is going to include all this return function and the curly brackets and all of that stuff. And I think that kind of clutters the output, so we can remove that. This definitely is not part of the .html tutorial, but hang tight. Hopefully I got that right. Let's test it. Hey. So I know that was pretty tedious, but now we can move on to some more interesting examples using the framework we've built. Check this out. So now if I want to add an example, I just call this widget. And let's say I want to do conditional elements now. So I guess the cool thing about using JavaScript to render markup is that you could always use if statements, but I actually have a built-in if function just inside of dot here. And the way this works is the first parameter it accepts is the condition, and the second parameter is the callback to execute if the condition evaluates to true. The advantage of using the if function over using a JavaScript if statement is that the if function is chainable and can be passed into other .html elements. So in this sense, .html kind of is its own complete language in a sense. And there's also an else function and, else if. Should have that first. And we're going to use all three in this example. By the way, in case you're having an OCD episode about the indentation of these anonymous functions, the reason I'm doing this is the inner bodies of these functions have to be rendered inside of pre-elements, and white space is not truncated when it comes to pre-elements. So bear with me, we're going to do a rock, paper, scissors game, and the mentality I have is that we're going to choose between rock, paper, scissors, and then print out the result. And well, there's going to be a 33% chance of it being rock, so we'll put that here. If math.random is less than 0.33, then print out rock. Now, if that doesn't execute, there's going to be a 50-50 chance between paper and scissors. So else if math.random is less than 0.5, paper, and otherwise we're just going to print out scissors. And these don't have to be in any type of element. I could pass in dot here if I wanted. I could do dot.div scissors or dot.h scissors, okay, but I'm just going to pass the string. That works just fine, and that will be rendered as a text node. So if it's not rock, if it's not paper, it's going to be scissors, and so there's a 33% chance of each. And don't forget your semicolon, not that it really matters in JavaScript. And we'll give this a run. Yeah, it's still printing to example 1. Hang on a sec. So there's actually two problems here, and kudos to anyone who had the foresight to catch this ahead of time. But basically, the incrementation was happening after the return statement. There's actually another problem here. I get caught with this stuff all the time. Why don't you pause the video and try to see if you can figure out what the bug is yourself. It's a pretty good exercise. Basically, the problem is that this inner function here doesn't execute until the click, but we're using example num, which is a global variable. And of course, it'll always use the last value that example num has. So kind of funny that the first bug that I had here will always print into the first example box, but now that I've updated this code, it will always print into the last example box if I refresh it, no matter what. And we can just fix that quite easily, oops, by putting that, putting example num into a new variable. Might as well do it here since we're incrementing it early. And use this variable instead of the example num variable. And this is guaranteed to be a fresh number every time. But there you have it. That was a fun adventure. Okay, let's run this. Make sure it works now. Okay, so there you go. Rock, paper, scissors at random. Well, guys, we're already past 12 minutes for this video, so I think this module has gone on for long enough. I'm going to put a break here, and then we'll continue with iterative and delayed elements in the next video. And then depending on timing, I might throw in jQuery wrappers and maybe a few other features. So take a breather and then check that out, and I'll see you there.